July the 4th is Independence Day. Happy birthday, America. Almost 250 years ago, America decided to break away from Britain. Except, of course, this year, July the 4th, isn't just American Independence Day. By happy coincidence, it also happens to be the day of a general election back in the old country, back in Britain, back in my old country, I should say. Back in Britain, we see a general election on July the 4th that is likely to see Britain's Conservatives, who've been in office for the past 14 years, absolutely and catastrophically annihilated. Britain's Conservatives have been historically one of the most successful parties anywhere in the West. Britain's Conservatives have been winning elections for generations. Only 5 years ago, Boris Johnson, the then leader of the British Conservatives, was elected Prime Minister with a thumping majority, one of the largest majorities that the Conservatives had enjoyed since the days of Maggie Thatcher. Yet today, 5 years later, of the 650 seats in the British Parliament, the Conservatives will be lucky if they win 100. What's going on? I think it's fair to say that the past 5 years of Conservative administration have been characterised, above all, by catastrophic incompetence. It's one thing to get things wrong. It's another thing to be so utterly incompetent that even when you're right, you make a mess of it. That's a pretty fair summary of Britain's Conservatives. Shortly after he was elected, Boris Johnson's courtiers of chaos, or court of chaos, started to fall apart. He had a chief of staff who famously didn't get on with various other courtiers. There were squabbles worthy of a soap opera. All of this meant that rather than actually coming into office with a clear agenda for government, a clear sense of what it is they were trying to do and how they might go about doing it, they descended into shambolic chaos. But it got worse than simple chaos. One of the few things that they did on coming to office was respond to the COVID lockdowns, the COVID crisis, I should say, with a series of lockdowns. Now, I don't happen to believe that COVID was really a crisis. I think it was a dangerous disease that flared up that could have been responded to far better. Here in the United States, different states took different approaches. Here in Mississippi, official policy was fairly relaxed. You were advised not to do certain things, but a lot of it was left up to you to exercise your judgment. Over in California, officials were much more restrictive. In Britain, where these decisions are pretty much made centrally, government was pretty draconian. In fact, Britain had some of the most restrictive COVID lockdowns anywhere in the Western world. Over a period of 18 months, three pretty draconian lockdowns were imposed on the country that consigned a large percentage of the population to what was in effect a form of house arrest. People were paid to sit at home and be economically inactive. And as you might imagine, if people are paid to sit at home and be economically inactive, number one, they are economically inactive, so output goes down. Number two, the debt to pay for them to be economically inactive goes up, so taxes had to go up to pay for it, which is exactly what's happened. And thirdly, if people are paid to be economically inactive for a period of time, some of them are likely to want to remain economically inactive, and that's pretty much what's happened. Lockdowns meant that Britain suffered from a deeply harmful, self-inflicted economic wound. But it gets worse. Under Boris Johnson, Britain's Conservatives became obsessed with the idea of zero emissions energy. This means that instead of using all the coal and gas and oil that Britain is fortunately surrounded by, Britain imposed bans on the use of oil and gas, and under Theresa May, Boris Johnson's successor, a series of, in effect, socialist planning was imposed on the energy economy. Boris Johnson made it even worse, setting a series of unrealistic goals, demanding that energy be produced using renewable sources. The effect of all of this, predictably, is to mean that energy costs in Britain rose. Higher energy costs meant that certain types of economic activity in Britain, business, commercial activity, became simply unviable. It meant that the cost of doing business in Britain rose, everything from food prices to steel processing rose. It was a second self-inflicted failure by the Conservatives. Now, for about 30 years, the British economy has become gradually less competitive. Taxes have risen, regulations and restrictions have risen. There's been a blizzard of red tape that has smothered the British economy's ability to innovate. Now, to try to offset the drag effects of high tax and high regulation, what successive governments have done is try to use monetary stimulus to generate that all-elusive growth. Rather than address the high tax and high regulation that creates a sclerotic economy, they've kept the taxes and the regulation in place, in fact raising taxes and raising the regulation, but they've used monetary stimulus to try to generate that elusive growth. In the short term it works, but in the long term it doesn't. Gradually, monetary stimulus, far from generating growth, has ended up generating inflation. And so this is what happened. Having imposed policies that have diminished prosperity in the country, the government then tried to hose new money, artificially created money, to generate growth. Instead, what they did is create inflation that left a lot of people in Britain feeling a lot poorer. But it gets even worse. For the past 5 years, the clowns running the country have got it into their heads that in order to generate growth, they needed an open doors immigration policy. Under the delusional belief that immigration from pretty much anywhere will always stimulate growth, they've let people in from anywhere. Now, it's pretty obvious if you look at the data from across Europe that different types of immigration have different consequences. If you allow in immigration through a very selective process, choosing people who are of high capital value, who have high skill sets, who are culturally compatible, then yes, immigration can stimulate growth. But if you allow people in from anywhere, particularly people with low skills and from low income countries, what tends to happen is that far from stimulating economic growth, you simply make the country poorer. This is exactly what's happened. Britain's per capita, per person income has declined. Now, Britain has had open border immigration over the past 5 years to the point where in the UK today, 1 in 30 people living in the country has arrived in the country in the past 2 years. Inflation, the government has failed to control. Immigration, the government has failed to control. In fact, they presided over both as a response to their own failures over COVID and over renewable energy. There's a fifth failure of the British Conservative administration. When you come to office as a Conservative, if you don't establish control over the administrative state around you, over the civil servants, over the career officials around you, if you don't establish control over them, they will sooner or later start to establish control over you. And that's exactly what happened. Boris Johnson was in effect ousted as Prime Minister, not because he was rejected by the British people, not because he lost an election. He wasn't even really kicked out by his own party. He was the victim of a squalid coup orchestrated by unelected officials. And at the heart of the case against him was the issue of whether or not he had eaten a slice of birthday cake. Really. Britain's Conservatives show Conservatives around the world how not to do it. Now, don't get me wrong, it's going to be painful to watch the results on July the 4th. Much as though I will celebrate being in the United States and celebrate Independence Day, watching an unpopular, uninspiring Labour government being elected with a massive majority because of the failures of the Conservatives will be painful. Nothing that the Labour government does will make any of these things better. They will double down on the green energy madness, the open borders madness, the high taxes, the high regulation. But at least after July the 4th, socialism in Britain will be being imposed by an overtly left-wing government. For years now we've had a soft left agenda, and sometimes not such a soft left agenda, imposed on Britain by a government that is supposed to be conservative. I'd say that the British Conservatives' singular biggest achievement over the past 14 years has not been Brexit. That was forced on them. They didn't want to do it. They were forced to embrace Brexit because of a referendum. The single biggest achievement of the British Conservatives over the past 14 years has been to ensure that when people vote for a Conservative government, they end up with a left-wing Social Democrat administration. July the 4th calls time on that. It's going to be painful. It means that for the next 5, maybe 10 years, the UK is going to be in a bad way. It's going to be like the 1970s all over again. But let's hope that the defeat that the British Conservatives suffer finally wake them up to the fact that if you accept the leftist narrative in office, all you do is invite an even more extreme version of the left in government. Britain's Conservatives have failed badly, but the country, encouragingly, remains conservative. If you add up the total number of votes that Britain's Conservatives will get and Reform, the new insurgent party, will get, you've got the makings of a solid Conservative majority. Let's just see if the British Conservative Party can actually start to produce leaders and candidates who reflect what that Conservative bloc want. Happy July the 4th, whichever side of the Atlantic you're on.